invasion. First of all, we should admit, and I have said this before, that the fall of the Soviet Union was the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of this century. August. Both the Abkhaz Autonomous Republic and the South Ossetian Autonomous District were created after the Sovietization of Georgia. That way, Moscow set its time bombs. If Russia's dominance in the Caucasus, and in Georgia in particular, were to come under any threat, these bombs were meant to explode. For years, the Kremlin methodically implemented anti-Georgian policies in these territories, aiming to Russify the local residents and alienate them from Georgians. The Abkhaz and the Ossetians enjoyed a wide range of rights in their autonomies. As opposed to the autonomies that were a part of the Russian Federation, Abkhazia and South Ossetia had all the conditions to develop Abkhaz and Ossetian cultures and preserve their languages. Their historic heritage was under protection. There were no objective reasons for starting armed conflicts in these regions. The bloodshed that began in the early 1990s was fully inspired and controlled by the Kremlin. It was with Moscow's support that the separatists forced out about 300,000 Georgians and turned Abkhazia and South Ossetia into criminal enclaves. By early 1994, the Kremlin achieved its goals in Georgia. Russia inspired armed conflicts which led to the creation of two separatist states in Abkhazia and the Tskhinvali region, which directly reported to Russia. Russia directly influenced Georgia's development, its political course, and its orientation through these regions. Disguised as peacekeepers, Russian military personnel were placed in the conflict zones and ensured their stay in Georgia with various agreements. On June 24, 1992, Georgia and Russia sign a peace agreement in Sochi. Russia is assigned the function of a peacekeeper in the Tskhinvali region. The mixed peacekeeping forces are created, consisting of 3 battalions, 1 Russian, 1 Georgian, 1 North Ossetian. This agreement provides for the presence of the OSCE observers in the region. The zone of action of the peacekeeping forces is clearly set. An area of 15 kilometers in radius around the Tskhinvali center was considered the conflict zone. A 14-kilometer wide stretch of land was called the safety corridor, with 7 kilometers allocated on both sides of the administrative border of the former South Ossetian Autonomous District. This meant that Russia received an official right to act inside Georgian territory. A peace agreement was also signed in connection with Abkhazia. On April 4, 1994, the Pact of Political Regulation of the conflict was signed in Moscow. The collective CIS peacekeeping forces were supposed to be stationed in Abkhazia. In fact, the peacekeepers only included Russian soldiers. A 48-kilometer wide safety zone was established at the administrative border between Gali and Zugdidi, with 24 kilometers on each side in each district. It was stipulated that deploying any type of heavy weaponry, artillery, or military units was forbidden in this area. In those years, the so-called peacekeepers controlled a territory much wider than Russia is currently occupying. During the military action in 2008, the peacekeepers took an active part in the ethnic cleansing of Georgians, along with regular Russian units. According to the 1994 agreement, Russia, as a guarantor of peace in the region, was supposed to facilitate the return of IDPs. It was as much a fiction as Russia's peacekeeping role in general. The Kremlin obstructed the peaceful population in the conflict in every way possible. The rights of the local Georgian population were constantly violated due to the indifference and frequent direct intervention of Russian soldiers. About 2,000 civilians were killed in the conflict zone controlled by the Russian peacekeepers alone. At the same time, more than 100 representatives of the peacekeeping forces were killed, mainly due to a lack of discipline, drinking, road accidents, and internal brawls.
Moscow
fully controlled the situation in Abkhazia and South Ossetia. Russia funded and directed separatist governments in Sukhumi and Tskhinvali. These regions depended on Russia politically, economically, and socially. The uncontrolled areas were used for arms and drug trafficking. People were often kidnapped. Abkhazia and South Ossetia became black holes, where all types of trafficking were underway. The most well-known spot for that was the market in the village of Ergneti, from which large quantities of uncontrolled goods were flowing into Georgia. According to approximate calculations, Georgia lost about $120 million in annual revenue. On the international arena, Russia always verbally supported Georgia's territorial integrity. Moreover, Moscow even recognized the ethnic cleansing of Georgians in Abkhazia by separatist units. Evidence of this ethnic cleansing was recorded at the OSCE Budapest summit in December 6, 1994. Russia voted for the resolution. The same thing happened in December 1996 in Lisbon. The OSCE resolution confirmed ethnic cleansing and expressed concern that the IDPs were not allowed to return to their homes. In January 1996, the leaders of the CIS countries decided to isolate the separatist Abkhazian regime. It was forbidden to establish any political, trade, economic, or military relations with the separatists without Tbilisi's approval. The Russian Federation also signed this agreement. The ethnic cleansing of Georgians in Abkhazia was confirmed at the OSCE summit in Istanbul in 1999. Another important decision on Georgia was made at that forum. The main goal of the Istanbul summit was to sign the Treaty on Conventional Armed Forces in Europe. Each country received its individual quota. 30 countries joined the treaty, including Russia. The agreement set an international basis for decreasing and later withdrawing Russian military forces from Georgian territory. Georgia and Russia made a joint statement in Istanbul. Russia took an obligation to remove its military bases from Georgia. Nevertheless, Moscow used every means to delay this process. Kremlin had the goal of keeping the status quo in Georgia and other conflict regions. It was not interested in resolving the conflicts because it would mean losing its mechanism of influence over Tbilisi. For years, the peace talks in which Russia was the main negotiator were just formal meetings. Moscow actively objected to the involvement of international organizations in the peace process. Russia created the illusion that it was the sole guarantor of peace and there was no alternative. Russia's carefree policy in the conflict regions was in trouble after power in Georgia changed in 2003. The new government, led by President Mikhail Saakashvili, deemed the removal of Russian bases from the country to be a priority. During Soviet times, a massive military unit was stationed in the Caucasus. Its main goal was to protect the country in case of war with NATO member countries. The army units were located in Georgia, Azerbaijan, and Armenia, and were controlled from this very building. This is the Caucasus Military District headquarters. After the fall of the Soviet Union, the Caucasus Military District was renamed the Group of Russian Armed Forces in the Caucasus, with its headquarters still in this building. In the early 1990s, Russia partially withdrew its forces from Georgia. But there were 4 bases located in strategic regions from which Russia could continue to control all of Georgia's territory. There were bases in Vaziani, not far from Tbilisi, in Batumi, Akhalkalaki, and Gudauta. Altogether, there were more than 5,000 soldiers in Georgia, 4,000 pieces of armored equipment, and 170 artillery systems. Echelon number 1 is ready for movement, General Major Achalov.
General-Major Achalov.
After persistent negotiations and long talks, Russia began to withdraw its forces from Georgia in 2005. The bases in Batumi, Vaziani, and Akhalkalaki were removed by 2007. But the Istanbul Agreement was not fully implemented. The base in Gudauta, located in separatist Abkhazia, was still in place. Besides discussing the issue of military bases, Saakashvili's government began to work out a new concept for settling the conflicts. It stipulated active involvement of the international community in the peace process. The Georgian government worked out a package of proposals on both conflict regions. It offered wide autonomy to Abkhazia and South Ossetia within Georgia and unlimited possibilities of development for the Abkhaz and Ossetian ethnicities. January 26, 2005. The Georgian president presents the plans for resolving the conflict in the Tskhinvali region to the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe. Autonomy was proposed along with constitutional guarantees and direct elections to local legislative and executive autonomous bodies. According to the initiative, Tskhinvali authorities would control the economy, culture, education, and issues related to ecology. South Ossetia would be represented in all branches of power in Georgia. The Ossetian language would become official. In the past, South Ossetia represented an old Soviet form of autonomy. According to the plan presented by us, it will now have a much fairer form of autonomy. Our vision is based on creating a South Ossetian autonomy in the Tskhinvali region. We offer much wider autonomy with more rights than North Ossetia currently has within the Russian Federation. In particular, our plan stipulates granting constitutional guarantees to the autonomy, which include direct elections to autonomous bodies. This region will have a parliament, a fully functional parliament. It means that it will control such issues as education, culture, social and economic policies, public security, self-governance, and protection of nature. December 6, 2005, the OSCE Ministerial Council makes a statement on Georgia. The OSCE member countries, including Russia, welcome the initiative on the peaceful conflict resolution. But later, Russia breaks off the implementation of the peace plan under the pretext that the separatist government objected to the initiative. Nevertheless, with the help of donor countries, Georgia begins to implement the rehabilitation program in the conflict region. It was assumed that this program would help bring the two ethnic groups closer and revive the region. The plan to renovate the energy supply system was presented. The gas pipeline was connected. Administrative buildings, schools, hospitals, and culture centers were built and renovated along with drinking and irrigation water systems. The OSCE Donor Conference allocates €8 million for this program. Georgia spends 15 million lari. In March 2007, the Georgian government addressed the sides of the conflict and the international community with a memorandum on necessary actions for final conflict resolution in the Tskhinvali region. It stipulated direct negotiations of the sides with the participation of the OSCE, EU, US, and Russia. Moreover, it stipulated the full demilitarization of the region and the involvement of a joint Georgian-Ossetian police force. It was planned to grant South Ossetia wide autonomy and create a legislative base with the help of the OSCE and the European Commission. Russia and the separatist governments categorically rejected these proposals. The provocateurs are not happy with the plans we have proposed to peacefully resolve the conflict in Abkhazia, South Ossetia, and Transnistria. They want to take us out of these processes under any pretext and change our peacekeepers for Western ones. They want to cross out all of the agreements which are based on the equality of the conflicting sides. I underline. At the same time, the Georgian government began working on a peace initiative for Abkhazia. In June 2006, Georgia proposed a peace plan to the de facto Abkhazian government. Abkhazia was to receive wide autonomy within a federal Georgian state and representation in the central power. It was strictly guaranteed that the Abkhaz language, culture, and historic heritage would be protected. In 2008, these proposals were complemented and solidified. On March 28th, the Georgian president announced a new peace initiative. Abkhazia was to receive unlimited autonomy and the right to establish free economic zones. The customs and border services were to be united. Moreover, the post of vice president was to be created for a representative from Abkhazia, who would have the right to veto initiatives connected to Abkhazia. We offer the Abkhaz to immediately begin talks on all these issues. The lack of negotiations influenced by external factors is the main problem. It forces the situation into a deadlock. There is no issue that we, the Georgians and the Abkhaz, cannot resolve through negotiations, except partitioning Georgia. I want to underline this. All other issues, such as practically unlimited autonomy, wide federalism, and serious representation in the central Georgian government, can be guaranteed, including internationally and with the help of the international community. Just as in the Tskhinvali region, Georgia's peaceful initiatives in Abkhazia brought no results. On Moscow's orders, the Abkhazian authorities rejected all of Tbilisi's proposals. Russia's sphere of influence included not only Sukhumi and Tskhinvali. With the help of the separatist enclaves, the Kremlin tried to spread its influence through all of Georgia. This was one of the main parts of Russian foreign policy. Moscow tried to restore its positions it lost after the fall of the USSR. By the end of the 20th century, not only the Eastern European countries left Russia's sphere of influence. Former Soviet republics, once controlled by Moscow, refused to report to the former parent state. In 2000, former KGB officer Vladimir Putin became Russian president. He set the goal of reviving the Soviet Union as a priority. The first step towards this was getting back the Soviet anthem.
Верно служить народу.
This would become the anthem of the modern Russia. A new confrontation with NATO began after Putin came to power. The world was facing a new Cold War. Moscow resisted the NATO expansion by all means. The membership of Eastern European countries and the Baltic states in the alliance especially outraged Moscow. Ukraine and Georgia were next. According to Kremlin politicians, losing these two countries would be catastrophic for Russia. Georgia always occupied a special place in the Kremlin's policies. It was Moscow's key to the Caucasus. By controlling Tbilisi, Moscow controlled the whole Caucasus. In the early 21st century, Georgia was slowly moving out of Russia's sphere of influence. The new government followed a pro-Western course, which posed a threat to the revival of the empire. First of all, it was about a completely different set of values, which strongly varied from the Russian officials' mentality. Moreover, Georgia exported the system throughout the post-Soviet space. So the Russian authorities made it a priority to intimidate the new Georgian government. If the blackmail didn't work, the Kremlin counted on a simple change of power in Georgia to a government that would be loyal to Moscow. Georgia also was creating economic problems. The Russian economy depends on energy. In 2008, the price of oil significantly increased. A barrel of oil cost $147 in July, setting an all-time record. Russia is a major supplier of natural gas and oil to Europe, competing with the oil fields in the South Caucasus. The alternative Baku-Supsa and Baku-Tbilisi-Ceyhan oil pipelines run through Georgia. In the fall of 2008, it was planned to sign agreements to build a new gas pipeline, Nabucco, which would seriously compete with Russian gas deliveries to the European market. So, Russia had little interest in the independence and self-determination of Abkhazia and South Ossetia. The Russian government perceived them as an instrument to put pressure on Georgia. The goal of inspiring unrest in the separatist regions was clear: taking over Georgia and turning its political course 180 degrees backwards. The South Ossetian people want to unite and live within Russia. Russia began to methodically prepare itself to achieve its goals. One of the first decisions made by President Putin in 2000 was introducing visa restrictions for Georgian citizens. However, the visa limitations did not apply to the residents of the breakaway regions. In 2002, Moscow began to issue Russian passports in Tskhinvali and Abkhazia en masse. This violated international law and Russian legislation. As a result, 80% of the residents of Abkhazia and 90% of the residents of the Tskhinvali region held Russian passports. The Kremlin said that they are Russian citizens and Moscow would take all measures to protect them. On July 13, 2007, Russian President Vladimir Putin signs the decree on Russia's exit from the Treaty of Conventional Armed Forces in Europe and international agreements related to it. The possible deployment of parts of the US missile shield in Poland and to the Czech Republic caused this in Russia. Exiting the treaty gave Moscow the possibility of keeping its military base in Gudauta and an unlimited military contingent at its North Caucasian borders with Georgia. In early 2008, significant changes took place in world politics. On February 17th, Kosovo pronounced itself independent from Serbia and was recognized by most of the world's leading countries, except Russia. A new state was created due to the ethnic cleansing of Albanians by the Serbs. Sharing the same religion with Russia, Serbia was considered Russia's strategic partner in the Balkans. So the Kremlin tried to protect its interests by all means. The recognition of Kosovo's independence was perceived by Moscow as a challenge from the West, and Russia promised to respond. The Kremlin did not hide its outrage. Putin openly said that Russia had some homework ready, implying that it would recognize the separatist regions. We have Abkhazia and South Ossetia and Transnistria existing as independent states. We are always being told that Kosovo is a special case. That's a lie. There is no special case there, and everyone knows it. Moscow did not delay its response. On March 6, 2008, Russia unilaterally quit the 1996 CIS agreement, imposing economic sanctions against the separatist government. Moscow explained its decision by protecting the humanitarian rights of the Abkhazian population. Soon thereafter, the Kremlin went further. May 21, 2008, the lower chamber of the Russian State Duma, the parliament, passes a resolution urging the executive branch to recognize Abkhazia and South Ossetia.
Недавнее заявление Государственной Думы.
The State Duma made a recent statement about the principles of Russia's policies towards Abkhazia, South Ossetia, and Transnistria. In cooperation with the corresponding ministries and agencies, we count on preparing appropriate reactions to the proposals. The appeal to the President and the government, which is a part of the statement, to review the issue of recognizing independence of Abkhazia and South Ossetia is of special interest. I assure you that it will be reviewed very carefully, taking into consideration all of the factors. The unilateral pronouncement of independence by Kosovo is definitely one of those factors. It has to set a precedent. Double standards are unacceptable.
Уважаемый Борис Вячеславович, уважаемые депутаты Государственной Думы.
This resolution was not a simple warning to Georgia. Russia was acting according to a prepared plan that was supposed to grow into a war in the near future. Russia was only waiting for a convenient moment to present itself in the international situation, studying the attitudes towards Georgia in world politics. In early April 2008, a NATO summit takes place in the capital of Romania, Bucharest. One of the main issues it discussed was the alliance's expansion and admitting Ukraine and Georgia for a membership action plan process. For Russia, it was the most sensitive issue. It became almost a matter of honor for Putin not to allow the two ex-Soviet republics to get the status. Moscow took all possible measures for Georgia and Ukraine not to receive the map. On April 4th, the alliance decides that it should abstain from granting Georgia and Ukraine the status of a map-holding country at that stage. However, it states that both countries would become NATO members after a certain period of time.
NATO welcomes Ukraine's and Georgia's Euro-Atlantic aspirations for membership in NATO. We agree today that these countries will become members of NATO.
Nations do not take their freedom for granted. They still remember life without it.
The alliance hoped that such a statement would calm down Kiev and Tbilisi without outraging the Kremlin.
Democracy.
As it later turned out, this decision caused quite the contrary consequences. Instead of pacifying Moscow, this compromise emboldened Russia. The Kremlin decided that the West gave Russia the green light in regards to Georgia. 2 weeks after the NATO summit, Vladimir Putin signed a decree on April 16, 2008, which allowed Russia to establish direct contact with the de facto governments of Abkhazia and South Ossetia. In fact, it already meant a declaration of war and a direct annexation of Georgian territory. The president of our country, Vladimir Putin, has given an order to the government connected to regulating relations with Abkhazia and South Ossetia. The order corresponds to Russia's political course, based on the norms of international law, and stipulates substantial support to the population of both republics and Russian citizens living in them. It includes organizing trade, information, scientific, cultural, and educational cooperation, which will involve Russian regions. Our actions towards Abkhazia and South Ossetia do not mean that Russia opts for confrontation with Georgia. The United States, Great Britain, France, Germany, the EU, OSCE, and NATO call on Russia to withdraw this decree, but the calls were left unanswered. Russia had already set the war machine running. The Kremlin did not want to back off. Full-fledged preparations for the war began on April 17th. The following day, after Putin signed the decree, 300 Russian military officers with equipment and weapons arrived at the Otamchira military base, in violation of all of the agreements. The Kremlin was beginning to demonstrate direct aggression. On April 20th, a Russian fighter shot down a Georgian drone over the village of Gagida in the Gali region.
Вся эта проблема заключается в том, почему этот беспилотник вообще появился там, где летать не положено.
The problem is why this drone appeared in the area where it was not supposed to fly. The Moscow Agreement of 1994, supported by the UN Security Council, directly forbids any non-sanctioned military action in the conflict zone. The drone was shot down in the zone of conflict, and it is unclear what it was doing there.
Конфликта, и непонятно, что он там делал.
Military presence in the conflict zone was increasing by the day. By the end of April, there were 4,000 Russian military personnel in Abkhazia instead of the allowed 2,000. Heavy equipment was also actively transported into the conflict area. Amphibious troops from Pskov and Novorossiysk were brought in under the umbrella of the peacekeeping mission, carrying artillery systems forbidden by the agreement. At the same time, 250 officers from the Chechen Vostok Battalion, which was a part of the Russian Defense Ministry's main investigation directorate, were deployed to the Tskhinvali region. An additional military company was stationed on the Sverdyako upland, not far from Tskhinvali. A corps of Russian railway military personnel was brought into Abkhazia on May 31st to begin restoration of the Abkhaz stretch of railroad. These rehabilitation works were part of the Russian government's aggressive plan. The renovated stretch was supposed to allow the quick movement of heavy military equipment and personnel deep into Georgian territory. Units of the regular Russian army were stationed in Achamchira, Babushera, Bambora, Sukhumi, Tsebelda, Akhure, Gagra, Lata, Gurauta, Tskhinvali, and Java by the spring of 2008. The Georgian government tried to draw the attention of the international community to the growing tensions in the separatist regions. After that, the involvement of the international organizations in regulating the conflict significantly increased. The UN Security Council passed a resolution in April 2008 which discussed the return of IDPs to Abkhazia. 1 month later, on May 15, 2008, the UN General Assembly passed the same resolution. It directly discussed the right of every internally displaced person from Abkhazia to return home. The General Assembly today recognized the right of all refugees and internally displaced persons and their descendants, regardless of ethnicity, to return to Abkhazia, Georgia. Emphasized the importance of preserving property rights of refugees and internally displaced persons, including victims of reported ethnic cleansing, and called upon all member states to deter persons under their jurisdiction from obtaining property within the territory of Abkhazia, Georgia, in violation of the rights of returnees. Underlined the urgent need for the rapid development of a timetable to ensure the prompt voluntary return of all refugees and internally displaced persons to their homes. Requested the Secretary General present a report on the implementation of this resolution at the 63rd General Assembly session. This resolution gave an opportunity to create a schedule for the return of IDPs and was, as a consequence, a prerequisite for the peaceful conflict resolution. 2 weeks after the resolution was passed, ambassadors from 14 EU countries accredited in Georgia met with de facto Abkhazian President Sergei Bagapsh in Sukhumi on May 30th, 2008. They discussed the issue of the peace plan and the return of IDPs. The meeting was fruitless. The Abkhazian government followed Russia's directives and rejected all constructive proposals from the international community. July 2008, Western partners make one more step towards resolving the conflict. German Foreign Minister Frank-Walter Steinmeier presents his plan for resolving the conflict in Abkhazia. The plan consists of 3 stages. The first stipulates the signing of a non-use of force agreement by the 2 sides and the beginning of the process of returning IDPs. The second foresees a process of economic rehabilitation in the region. At the last stage, the sides were supposed to define Abkhazia's status in the composition of Georgia. The issue of the status has been delayed, but I think that it should be brought up as a priority, on the contrary. This is the most important thing for us. We have defined our status and we will do everything possible to gain our independence. The undivided attention of the international community on the situation in Abkhazia caused the Russia to make some corrections in its course. Capturing Georgia was supposed to start from here. The war shifted towards Tskhinvali, where the purposeful escalation of tension was given the full attention. It was more convenient to inspire unrest in Tskhinvali from the military point of view. The Russian government's strategic plan was to occupy all of Georgia. Tbilisi is much closer to Tskhinvali than to Abkhazia. The time most optimal for the military action was chosen to be between August 5th and 25th. The weather forecasts promised clear skies for these days. There were ideal conditions for moving equipment and making military flights. Separatist units were entrusted with increasing the tensions. Russian military units, which were earlier deployed to Tskhinvali, were supposed to unofficially provide them with assistance. Kokoity's regime was supposed to increase tensions in order to make the Georgian government take full military measures. According to the Kremlin's calculations, full-fledged military action was supposed to last at least 2 weeks. It would cause a lot of casualties among civilians. In this case, Russia would get the chance to accuse Georgia of genocide against Ossetians and freely enter the region. In mid-July 2008, Russian military units were undergoing final preparations before the invasion into Georgia. Moscow held the large-scale Caucasus 2008 military exercises from July 15th to August 2nd. The drills were unprecedented in scale for the North Caucasus over the previous 20 years. Up to 8,000 soldiers and more than 700 pieces of equipment took part in the exercise near the Georgian border next to the Mamysan and Rokip crossings. This special operation for enforcing peace in the conflict zones of a neighboring country and a humanitarian intervention were being rehearsed in the drills. Russian soldiers were handed leaflets which called the Georgian army the main enemy. When the exercises finished, the military units did not go back to their bases. The majority of them were stationed near the Russian-Georgian border, close to the Tskhinvali region. Besides the exercises on land, the drills involving the Sea Fleet were also underway. The Russian Black Sea Fleet took part in 8 military exercises in April and July 2008. 3 of them concentrated on landing troops. The situation in the Tskhinvali region escalated to the limit in late July. Exchanges of fire happened almost every day. August 1st, a police vehicle is bombed on the Eredevi-Kheti side of the road, injuring 6 policemen. Ossetian armed gangs fired at Georgian villages on the same day. Georgia immediately returned fire. August 2nd, the sides exchanged fire again. The shooting began at 4 a.m. I laid down on this bed. When the shooting began, I got scared and got up. Before I even approached the door, something threw me to the side. The roof that you see here was fully destroyed. Nothing was left of it. August 3rd, the Tskhinvali regime begins evacuating people from the city. This is clear evidence that the de facto South Ossetian government was preparing for military action. The next day, after the beginning of evacuations, Assedian armed groups opened fire on Georgian peacekeepers at the Sarabuki Height, injuring 2 soldiers. August 6th, 150 armed volunteers from the North Caucasus arrive in Tskhinvali. Artillery attacks on Georgian villages continue. Something awful was happening here in the dawn. I don't know how we survived. They were shooting from here, where the Russian peacekeepers are. Due to the escalation of the conflict, the Georgian president tried to call the Russian president by phone, but the Russian Foreign Ministry refused to arrange the communication. August 7th, 4 a.m. 150 units of armored equipment arrive in the Tskhinvali region through the rocky tunnel. The shelling of Georgian villages with heavy artillery begins in dawn. 4 soldiers were killed, killing 2 officers. The next day, Georgian Minister of Integration Timur Yakubashvili leaves for Tskhinvali. He meets with Chief Commander of the Russian Peacekeeping Battalion, General Marat Kulakmetov. Kulakmetov says at the meeting that he is not able to control the separatists' military activities. The Georgian government does not abandon its attempt to prevent the war. At 7 p.m., August 7th, Georgian President Mikhail Saakashvili addresses the nation on TV with an emergency announcement. He says that Georgia has unilaterally ceased fire and calls for peace talks. I can say with full responsibility that as the Commander-in-Chief, I have given an order, a very difficult order, for every Georgian unit or any police station to abstain from returning fire even to very intense shelling. I offer you to immediately cease fire. I offer you to immediately begin peace talks. I confirm my plan proposed 3 years ago on granting practically unlimited autonomy for South Ossetia, special protection of all ethnic Ossetians in the autonomy that will be given all the international guarantees and all created by all EU standards. I also propose and am proposing now to the Russian Federation to be the guarantor of South Ossetian autonomy as a part of Georgia.
იყოს სამხრეთოსური ავტონომიის გარანტი საქართველოს ტერიტორიაზე.
Despite this, tensions continue to escalate. August 7, 9 p.m. Massive shelling of Georgian villages begins. At 11 p.m., separatists open fire at all Georgian positions around Tskhinvali, destroying the villages of Tamarasheni and Korta. 11:15 p.m., the Georgian commander-in-chief gives the order to begin a defensive operation. The goal of the operation is to protect civilians in the Tskhinvali region, suppress armed separatists, and halt the movement of the regular Russian army through the rocky tunnel. The Georgian armed forces take almost all of the populated areas overnight on August 2008, except the village of Java. The Georgian army's success came as a surprise to the Russian leadership. Moscow planned a long-term military action in the Tskhinvali region. Instead, the Georgian army was able to neutralize the separatist armed units and their supporters in the shortest period of time. August 8th, Russian President Dmitry Medvedev announces the beginning of the operation to enforce peace. You know that Russia was and is present on the territory of Georgia absolutely legally, implementing its peacekeeping mission in accordance with the signed agreements. We have considered and still consider preserving peace our main goal. Russia has historically been and will continue to be a guarantor of security for the nations of the Caucasus. Last night, the Georgian military, in fact, made an act of aggression against Russian peacekeepers and civilians. Right now in South Ossetia, civilians, women, children, and elderly are dying, with the majority of them being Russian citizens. According to the Constitution and federal law, as President of the Russian Federation, I am obliged to defend the lives and dignity of Russian citizens, wherever they happen to be. The logic of the steps we are about to take was conditioned by these circumstances. We will not allow unpunished the deaths of our compatriots. Russia begins open military actions against Georgia. The Russian 58th Army, stationed in the North Caucasus, passes through the Rocky Tunnel and enters Georgian territory. However, it faces resistance from the Georgian armed forces. The Russian army convoy is destroyed by Georgian artillery. Afterwards, Russian Prime Minister Vladimir Putin arrives in Vladikavkaz to personally lead the operation.
Это конкретный пиздец, нахуй. Такого не знал никто, блядь.
This is a total failure. This is practically all that's left of our battalion. Everything is burning there too.
Пацанов жалко.
I am sorry for the boys. 3 teams burned alive in front of our eyes.
Не включая БТРов, про БТР не знаю, они разведосы, блядь.
I don't know where the armed personnel carriers are. I think that it has become totally clear in Georgia, Russia, and the whole world that the effort of the Georgian government to become a NATO member was conditioned by its unwillingness to be part of the global security system and contribute its share of world peace. Its willingness to join NATO was conditioned by completely other goals, an attempt to involve other nations and other countries into its bloody adventures. As for Russia, our actions are fully grounded from the law and are legitimate. Moreover, they are necessary. August 8th, the Russian war machine is fully operational as the Kremlin planned. Additional landing forces are brought to the Tskhinvali region. The Russian Air Force fully controls the airspace, and Russian ships block the territorial waters of sovereign Georgia. Russian military planes violated Georgia's airspace 22 times on the very first day of war. Regarding the Georgian government, I have announced that we are implementing tactics to enforce peace according to United Nations statutes. We consider such tactics absolutely effective and the only ones possible. I remind you that history has many known examples of pacifying an aggressor. By the way, this is what the Western countries did 70 years ago, and you know what tragedy it all led to. I mean, first of all, the lessons learned from the Munich Pact of 1938. August 8th. The Georgian army still controls the city of Tskhinvali and nearby villages, but the situation is slowly beginning to change by the evening. The first convoy of Russian tanks appears in Tskhinvali, and fighting breaks out between the Georgian and Russian armies. Alongside the Tskhinvali situation, Russia opens a second front in western Georgia, where no military action was taking place. August 11th, Russian military units entered the towns of Zugdidi, Senaki, and the port of Poti. Together with Abkhazian separatists, Russians attack and take over Upper Abkhazia, called the Kadori Gorge. We offered the Georgian side to leave the Kadori Gorge to avoid casualties, but they always refused. So we had to work our way through with Air Force and artillery. At 5 a.m. this morning, we entered the upper part of the gorge and are moving forward. We have already reached the center of the gorge, the village of Avzhara. Our military units are currently there, moving towards the state Abkhazian border. Russian airplanes bombed Georgian territories outside the conflict zone. Both military facilities and essential civilian targets are destroyed. These actions are meant to cause panic among the Georgian population and ruin the Georgian economy. The Russian Air Force actively bombarded the towns of Gori and nearby villages, the town of Tskhinvali, Marneuli, Bolnisi, Poti, Senaki, Kutaisi, Tbilisi, and the village of Vaziani, the oil pipeline Tbilisi-Baku-Ceyhan near the village of Gachiani, and the Gardabani district, the Upper Abkhazia, the towns of Oni and Anaklia, and a village near Batumi. Our peacekeepers and units controlled by them are currently carrying out the operation of forcing Georgia into peace. They are also responsible for protecting the population.
По защите населения.
From the first days of war, the international community called on the conflicting sides to cease fire and withdraw troops from the conflict zone. Georgian President Mikhail Saakashvili signs the ceasefire agreement on August 11th, which was prepared by the foreign ministers of France and Finland. On the same day, the two ministers take the document to Moscow to be signed by Russian President Dmitry Medvedev. That day, August 11th, the Georgian government ceases fire in order to prevent further bloodshed and calls on Russia to do the same. The Georgian army holds against the overpowering forces of the enemy for several days, but Russia had an overwhelming superiority in firepower and equipment. Georgian units slowly begin to lose ground. After receiving orders to cease fire, the Georgian army fully withdraws from the Tskhinvali region. Paying the price price of their lives, being selfless and heroic, soldiers did not allow the Russian government to implement its plan and won precious time. The main goal of the Georgian army was now to defend Tbilisi. The army begins building a defensive line near the town of Tskata. August 12th, when Georgia's statehood was still in danger, the leaders of Poland, Lithuania, Estonia, Latvia, and Ukraine arrive in Tbilisi. They come to express their support to Georgia. Lech Kaczynski, Valdas Adamkus, Tomas Hendrik Ilves, Ivar Skodanis, and Viktor Yushchenko speak at the rally on the Rustaveli Avenue and address the Georgian nation with words of solidarity. They represent countries which also survived Soviet aggression and occupation in the recent past. We came to fight because our northern neighbor thinks that small countries should fall. We say no. U.S. President George Bush makes a statement of support to Georgia on the same day. Russia has invaded a sovereign neighboring state and threatens a democratic government elected by its people. Such an action is unacceptable in the 21st century.
Threatening Georgia's capital of Tbilisi.
The EU also condemns Russian aggression. Its statement underlines that the existing conflict must be resolved in the context of preserving Georgia's territorial integrity.
We consider that the latest developments, such as the crossing of the Georgian borders by Russian troops, change the dimension of the conflict. We therefore call upon Russia to stop immediately all military activity on Georgian territory. We consider Russia to be responsible for the entering of its troops on Georgian territory.
U.S. Ambassador to the UN Zalmay Khalilzad accuses Russia of attempting a coup by provoking Georgia into an armed conflict. U.S. Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice later repeats his words. I intend to tell everyone that the war led by Russia is aimed at overthrowing the government of Georgia. French Foreign Minister Bernard Kouchner made a similar statement. We had to stop the Russian army, and our one and only goal was to prevent the capture of the Georgian capital by the Russian forces. French President Nicolas Sarkozy arrives in Tbilisi August 12th. France chaired the EU at the time. Sarkozy brings with him the 6-point peace plan coordinated with the Russian president. The sides were to take on a non-use of force obligation, halt all military action, while the Georgian troops would return to their previous positions before the conflict, and Russian troops were to return to the lines they held before the start of the military operation. Despite the critical situation, the Georgian president does not sign the document. Tbilisi disagrees with the 6th point of the agreement, stipulating the start of an international discussion over the future status of South Ossetia and Abkhazia. Tbilisi's position is simple. Their status is already defined within Georgia and was not to be discussed. Mikhail Saakashvili signs the document only after its point 6 was changed. The new version notes the beginning of international discussions on the conditions of security and stability in Abkhazia and South Ossetia. The peace agreement finally enters into force September 16th, after it is signed by both Georgian and Russian presidents.
როცა გუშინ პრეზიდენტმა სარკოზიმ ჩამომიტანა მედვედევისგან დოკუმენტი.
President Sarkozy brought me a document from Medvedev yesterday, which contained the Russian dream about the future status of Abkhazia and South Ossetia to be discussed separately, hinting that they will be able to become independent, like Kosovo. But I categorically refused to accept that. After 3 hours of intense talks, this point was taken out of the agreement. The Georgian government will never agree to legalize the loss of its territories with the help of international mechanisms.
დაკარგვის დაკანონებას რაიმე საერთაშორისო მექანიზმების გზით.
მიუხედავად იმისა, რომ 12 აგვისტოს რუსეთის პრეზიდენტმა
Despite the Russian president's official statement on the ceasefire and full suspension of military operations on August 12th, the Russian army continued to bomb Georgian territory, destroy its infrastructure, and occupy its populated areas. By then, Russian forces had crossed the administrative border with South Ossetia and closed off the central highway near the town of Gori. Vehicle movement between western and eastern Georgia was interrupted. The occupiers aimed at paralyzing the whole country and destroying Georgia's economy. Several days later, Russian troops bombed the main railroad bridge near the village of Grekali. The western and eastern parts of the country are fully cut off from each other. The Russian military also blocks the port of Poti and the city itself. They do not let any ship through that is headed towards Georgia. Russian tanks appear near the village of Igoeti on August 13th. The Russian occupants were only 25 kilometers from the Georgian capital, Tbilisi. The occupying forces fully take over the Tskhinvali region and Abkhazia. August 11th, they entered the towns of Zugdidi and Senaki. On the same day, the central highway near the town of Gori, connecting eastern and western Georgia, is blocked. The Russian army takes over Upper Abkhazia and Poti on August 12th. August 13th, the towns of Gori, Khashuri, and Kareli are taken under their control by Russian troops. August 15th, Russian units appear in the Kapspi district and occupy Akhal Gori. Russian occupation units are followed by South Ossetian bandit groups, which mercilessly vandalize the villages in Gori, Kaspi, Khashuri, and Kareli districts. Looting, humiliating, raping, and murdering citizens are the norm. The Russian army and South Ossetian bandit groups loot military barracks, shops, and rob journalists. A wave of thousands of forcefully displaced people rush out of the occupied territories. We are coming from Dirtsnisi. All the houses are destroyed there. Russians are going in there now, killing people. They leave the bodies on the spot and burn the houses. Tanks have gone through, many tanks. The soldiers are armed with machine guns. If they see people in the yards, they shoot everyone. A catastrophic situation establishes itself in the Tskhinvali region. All Georgian villages were wiped off the face of the earth. The houses where Georgians used to live are leveled with bulldozers. August 15th, separatist leader Eduard Kokoity tells Russian newspaper Kommersant that the Georgian villages in South Ossetia had been fully cleansed and Georgians were never to be allowed back again. 250 hectares of unique forests in the Borjomi-Kharagauli Nature Preserve are destroyed and burned. The Russian army intentionally pollutes the waters of Poti. The Russian government has named several reasons for invading Georgia. The main ones were the necessity to defend Russian peacekeepers, stopping Georgia's aggression towards the population of South Ossetia, preventing genocide of the Ossetian population, and protecting Russian citizens. All of these reasons are fabricated. International law defines aggression as the use of armed force against the sovereignty, territorial immunity, or political independence of another state. This argument cannot be used about South Ossetia because the Tskhinvali region is an integral part of Georgia. As for ethnic cleansing, the Russian government publicly spoke from the first days of the war about the genocide of the Ossetian people and 2,000 civilian casualties who died during the shelling of Tskhinvali. None of the international organizations confirmed this. Sometime later, the investigative committee of the Russian prosecutor's office officially reported 162 casualties.
Будем называть вещи своими именами. Народ Южной Осетии.
Let's call things by their names. The people of South Ossetia have survived a genocide. And that's how we should talk about it. We will need years or maybe decades to heal these wounds. The extermination of a whole ethnic group was prevented, and it was legal, inevitable, and fully justified. Russia's arguments about protecting its own citizens also do not correspond to international norms. Issuing Russian passports was illegal from the start, even from the point of view of Russian legislation. Even under the pretext of protecting its own citizens, Russia had no right to use force on the territory of another state without the permission of appropriate international organizations, because protecting citizens often has a hidden goal of overthrowing the government. Georgia was forced to respond. Going to war was not Georgia's choice. Tbilisi had no other option. There were two possible scenarios. Georgia responded to the shelling of the Georgian villages, and then what happened, happened. Georgia did not respond to the military action. Then, South Ossetian bandit groups, with the veiled help of the Russian military, pushed the Georgian population out of the region, while Moscow kept its position of a silent observer. In early October 2008, Russian occupiers withdrew from the internal Georgian regions with the help of the international community. However, Russian occupation forces are still present in Georgia. August 26th, the Russian president signs a decree recognizing the independence of Abkhazia and South Ossetia in violation of all the norms of international law.
Подписал указы о признании Российской Федерации независимости Южной Осетии и независимости.
I have signed the decrees on the recognition of the independence of Abkhazia and South Ossetia by the Russian Federation. Russia calls on other states to follow suit. Russia occupied 20% of Georgian territory. It is building massive military bases in the regions it currently controls. Moscow is still trying to give its aggression legitimacy. However, no one has recognized the independence of separatist Georgian regions besides the odious leaders of Venezuela and Nicaragua. Even Russia's closest partners did not support it on this issue.
Спасибо. Сделал.
Russia is not ashamed of bribing some countries to support its aggression. In 2010, it bought the recognition of independence of Abkhazia and South Ossetia from the small Pacific island state of Nauru for $50 million.
2008 წლის აგვისტოში რუსეთის შეიარაღებული თავდასხმის შედეგად საქართველოს
About 130,000 people became IDPs after Russia's armed invasion in August 2008. Almost 32,000 still cannot return to their homes. Georgia lost its best sons. According to official data, 416 people were killed during the war. 166 soldiers, 16 policemen, and 220 civilians. 4,234 people were injured. The majority of the soldiers killed in August were buried at the Mukhatgverdi Cemetery of Honor. These soldiers gave their country the most precious thing they had, their lives. It is their great merit that Georgia preserved its statehood. The August War demonstrated that the conflicts in Georgia were provoked from the outside. Two ideological and mental systems, the Russian and the Western, confronted each other in the Caucasus region. Whether the West will be able to protect its values, which Georgia paid for with an attack on itself, is a matter of honor. In the 21st century, the world community has all the international and legal mechanisms for the territories where an ethnic cleansing took place not to be called a state. Even Stalin and Hitler did not do such a thing in their time. In this sense, the current Russian leadership has surpassed all of their mental predecessors. Restoring Georgia's territorial integrity is a matter of honor not only for Georgia itself, but for the whole civilized community. I am not ashamed of these decrees.